After watching this video lecture, students will be able to explain relative bonding associated with resonance in structures, as well as draw resonance structures for compounds that need it. So resonance is what we're going to be discussing here in relation to Lewis dot structures. So resonance happens when electrons are able to be shared between multiple atoms within a compound. So if we look at this series of examples here, I want you to notice that you have these 3 oxygens that are bonded to sulfur. Now the reality of it is that we could have double bonded this oxygen, or this oxygen. And the representations that we have here are representing that resonance process. So what resonance means is that the reality of it is, instead of having 2 single bonds and a single double bond, what we actually have is basically 1 1/3 bonds in each sulfur oxygen interaction. Okay, so we're representing that by showing all 3 resonance structures. So these arrows in between represent the interchangeability and basically represent this sharing. So the reality of it is what we see spectroscopically, so when we actually analyze this type of structure, is we see a bond length. We don't see 2 single bonds and a single double bond. What we actually end up seeing is a bond peak for basically 1 1/3. So resonance shows up in molecules that can have multiple bonds to various atoms that are interacting in a compound. So we can go ahead and look at another example. So let's go ahead and let's look at another example. For CO3 2- for the carbonate ion, if we were to do our Lewis dot structure, we would get this structure as our best Lewis dot structure. Okay, and we would draw this out in the same way that we've discussed multiple times now. Now, the reality of it is if we look at the structure, notice that we have oxygens, all sitting around that central atom, and they're all bonded to the central atom. So in this situation, we could have either picked this oxygen or this oxygen for this double bonding process. So that lets you know that resonance is possible. So once we find the best Lewis dot structure, we're going to represent the presence of resonance by drawing all 3 possible resonance structures. Okay, so we do so like this. Okay, and we show that arrow. Okay, and we show the other possible resonance structures that could have been or could exist. Okay, and in this case, 3 resonance structures are available. And so we're going to draw 3 of them because that's what is possible. So this is how we express resonance. Remember that the presence of resonance indicates that we do not have just individual bonds here. We don't have 2 single bonds and a double bond. All this extra bond here is actually being shared amongst all 3 of these carbon-oxygen bonds. It ends up being approximately 1 1/3 in terms of bond order. So resonance is pretty straightforward. It's connected to the ability to draw the correct Lewis dot structures. If you can draw the correct Lewis dot structures, you can subsequently get the resonance forms that you need. So benzene is an example of an organic compound that has resonance. And in the case of benzene, basically the double bonds that you see along the ring can actually move from location to location within the ring and subsequently give you a new resonance structure. Now, the reality of it is once again, we don't have 3 single bonds and 3 double bonds. What we actually have is something kind of in between. So basically we have 1 1/2 bonds along each of these carbon-carbon bonds. This type of resonance can be represented by drawing the two structures here, or with benzene, as well as other aromatic organic cyclic structures, you can just put the benzene ring in this circle, which implies that the electron density is being shared amongst all 6 atoms evenly. The reality of it is that the p orbitals are what are allowing this resonance to occur. If we look at the p orbitals here on this diagram, right? So we have p orbitals, pz orbitals on each of those carbon atoms. Okay, electrons are being shared here, okay, and here, okay, in the drawings that we see. However, the reality is that all of the electron density is being shared amongst all 6 of those orbitals, and basically confers the resonance that we see here for benzene. Now, this type of resonance and this type of bonding in the benzene rings leads to very high stability. So in a lot of compounds in nature, we will see benzene as a component of the molecular structure. And that leads to high stability and molecules that are able to last for a while under extreme conditions. So resonance can occur in plain old ions that we see in the day-to-day, polyatomic ions that are seen in salts and stuff like that. But they also occur in aromatic structures, and this aromaticity in this specific case supplies an extra level of stability in this specific compound.